When I talked about tactical driven operations a few moments ago in our conversation, one of the challenges continues to be our misunderstanding and misapplication of our building and occupancy classifications that are derived out of the NFPA 220 standard.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, that exposure leads to cancer. Protect yourself with MagnaGrip. To learn more, visit magnagrip.com.
Taking It to the Streets is all about advancing firefighter safety and operational integrity for the fire service. And now, the latest edition of Taking It to the Streets with your host, Christopher Naum.
Welcome to this edition of Buildings on Fire's Taking It to the Streets. I'm your host, Christopher Naum, on your street, in your city, across the country, and around the world. Taking It to the Streets is a monthly radio talk show program here on fireengineering.com. Blog Talk Radio is part of the Fire Engineering's commitment to exceptional training programming and our continuing efforts to bring a quality level training directly to you. As always, our heartfelt welcome to our dedicated and loyal listeners and to those that are listening in for their first time. Taking to the Streets is all about advancing operational excellence, decisive engagement for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions, focusing in on the built environment. Again, we've had a number of exceptional programs over the last couple of months here. We just finished off our three-part series here in our last episode on Buildings on Fires, talking about training and a variety of different challenges and issues affecting training both at the personal level, at the company, and certainly at the departmental level for personal development and professional growth, as well as developing the appropriate skills and competencies that are needed on today's demanding fireground as they relate back to building construction and the built environment. One of the things that we had mentioned in our previous episodes as we were finishing off our training series was talking a little about a concept or a series of discussion points and some insights that this particular episode is going to revolve under, revolving around what we have put together sort of at the bookend from the main street to the mega mansion, and really talking about the predictability of building performance on today's fireground. And that's the theme of our episode here today. From Main Street to the mega mansion, predictability of building performance and the adaptive fireground, and primarily giving us a little bit of time here to talk about some aspects of today's evolving and demanding fireground, the issues affecting the built environment, which continue to be the focal point of everything that we do on today's fireground. If we talk about the structural fireground, we talk about our buildings. Again, it is so important to have not only a firm foundation of knowledge, but to have intermediate and advanced level insights on the building, the compartment, the manner in which fire dynamics affect the building, and how the building and the fire conditions that we encounter ultimately will influence our decision-making, both at the tactical and at the strategic level. So some of the things that, again, as we get ready to get into this brief conversation here, will revolve around our continuing theme where we talk about, and again, it's nothing new to any of our listeners that have been listening to our program for a period of time here. The built environment continues to evolve at a faster and greater complexity, with greater hazards and greater risks to our firefighters and to our fireground than the tactical models are providing for. These continue to drive the aspect of what we call tactical driven operations, where building construction, both building typing and the associated tactics, are more fundamentally aligned with anecdotal methodologies and practices that have and continue to be very successful, but also end up driving both fire-driven tactics, tactical-driven operations, procedural-driven operations, without recognizing the fire dynamics and those associated factors that may be influencing operational decision making. And also that certainly may be impacting some of the tactical windows that various building types, different era and vintages of building types and construction may also affect our operations, and certainly may impact the firefighter safety, the integrity of companies, and certainly may not support the mission that we may be undertaking at hand. Many times we may find ourselves on an autopilot mode, and that is certainly a very detrimental related condition and may place us in harm's way, which again may be challenging in itself. In other words, we are placing ourselves into harm's way when we do enter our buildings that are involved, our structural fire conditions, and those in turn create a variety of both manageable and maybe unperceived levels of risk, but they all are part of our operational methodologies and practices. So again, this is not the first time I've utilized the term tactical driven operations. I think we're familiar with how our tactics sometimes drive or entirely influence our operations, and we can get into a conversation, a discussion here, certainly when we talk about the management of risks and how we manage, how we identify, how we manage those levels of risk on the fire ground. But many times we are truly in a situation where we have a building construction type or occupancy type tactical operation at hand, and many times our occupancy type driven tactics, again, are pretty much stretching the line and going in. We don't initiate those levels of actions and truly understanding the fireground architecture, understanding the building to the extent that we should. And our conversation here today is really, as I mentioned, everything from Main Street to mega mansions. And that analogy pretty much should be very self-revealing and very transparent. When we talk about our taxpayers, and we talk about type 3 constructed buildings, and we talk about Main Street construction, Main Street types of occupancies and buildings, or certainly any of our previous buildings, and again, I'll go back to our let's say 1980s vintage structures. So over 40 years past, or 40 years in the past, when we talk about construction that had a higher degree of predictability. The majority of our buildings were built in a very consistent manner. They followed very consistent practices, both in terms of the design, the methods and the materials of construction, the methodologies and practices that were employed in their design, in their construction, and certainly to a certain extent in their occupancy usages. Our tactics were derived from that level of consistency. And when we take a look at historically, and although I don't want to delve into the historical context of where we've come from and how our tactics have been developed as they align with construction, that is the entire premise and basis of era and vintage that align with architectural and the built environment. It's safe to say that we still continue to have challenges as they relate to identifying key elements of the building, key elements of the predictability of its performance, both pre-fire and then during fireground operations, and how they align with our decision-making processes, as well as in the aspect of tactical deployment. How do we engage in these particular structures? And it goes back to the fundamentals of both fire and building literacy, having the appropriate degree of operational modeling, and more importantly, in the context of our episode here, is having a much more adaptive approach toward our fireground operations. And that becomes the key. I think that becomes the takeaway, or becomes the angle when we talk about, when we discuss the aspects of the vast variety and variations of construction in buildings, coupled with the variations of how age, deterioration, occupancy changes, the renovations and alterations that have taken place over the decades and years of time, that all of those factors, coupled with fire dynamics, coupled with fire loading that are present, occupancy usages, occupancy risks, and those conditions that we encounter upon our arrival, they do demand of us to have a much more greater degree of adaptiveness in the development of our incident action plans, the identification of both primary and secondary tactical actions that need to be employed, more importantly, a greater appreciation for the tactical windows that are before us prior to engaging and stepping through that threshold and getting into the building. In other words, we have to have a much greater appreciation for the predictability of how that building will perform under those fire conditions upon our arrival, upon our reading the fireground, upon our reading the building, reading the compartment, and reading our companies to develop a sense of what that incident action plan is going to look like. More importantly, when I discuss and talk about the tactical windows, it all goes back to how much time do we have available to us, and then hopefully in an optimum level to engage in the priorities that are identified, that we are employing, and that we are getting engaged in. So it really gets back to having an adaptiveness based upon that building, based upon its occupancy, based upon the fire conditions, based upon the capabilities, limitations, the availability, and accessibility of our resources, meaning our companies and our personnel, utilizing critical thinking, conservative bias, self-regulating, discipline, resiliency, and getting ready to go to work. And that is a lot to be said when we throw that into that particular context. It's safe to say that when we talk about today's modern fireground, we talk about it in the context for many of you at the firefighter level, fire officer, both as company and commanding officers, and then many of you that are operating within the command capacity as first arriving incident commanders, or as you transfer command, assuming other command responsibilities, or for those of you that may be operating in the uppermost incident command capacity. We are operating as tacticians, as strategists, we're leaders, risk managers, safety managers, compliance officers, engineers, architects, scientists, behavioralists, statisticians. We're leaders, we're mentors, we're instructors, we're educators. We are all trying to put all of these things together to move our efforts forward as we engage in that building. And that becomes a challenge. It becomes a challenge when we don't have building and fire literacy, when we don't have a degree of understanding beyond the basic level. And we talked about this in the training series in our last 3 episodes, when we talk about building and developing building and fire literacy. We talk about understanding the building beyond the fundamentals of the 3 building types, and really getting into the weeds, as many of our episodes in the past have delved into. I think we are starting to develop, and for many of you, are developing this degree of literacy, which we have to continue to move forward. For our newest listeners, and those of you that have just joined into our series maybe more recently and have not been able to go back into the archives to listen in on some of our other programs that continue to build upon previous episodes, previous series, and really allow a very rich and multi-layered approach toward this development of understanding, the development of competencies and skill sets in a very technical, very highly technical domain. When we talk about building construction, we talk about what we term fireground architecture, talking about how that relates to stretching the line and going in. How does that relate to the tactical approach? Some of the continuing issues, and that's the theme of our program, where we talk about from Main Street to the mega mansions. That those 2 structural types are so dramatically on opposite ends of the spectrum. We talk about the Main Street building. We talk about a certain era and vintage from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. We talk about a degree of resiliency, integrity that affords us an operational time, which is far removed from the mega mansion, where the mega mansion, in terms of its size and volume and square footages, the lack of operational tactical windows, where we have a much diminished operational time frame that's allotted to us. But in each case, whether we talk about the Main Street building or we talk about the mega mansion structure and occupancy, each one has mission critical operations that have to be undertaken, but each one has a different tactical window that either works for us or may work against us as a challenge or a significant challenge to undertake operations. One building type may have a greater degree of resiliency and integrity over that delta time. However, the other may have a certain level of time, but again, does that diminish more significantly over a shorter period when we talk about building integrity? And that gets back into this whole angle on what we're trying to present. I think it's important to say that when we take a look at operational challenges on today's modern fireground, from Main Street to the mega mansion, residentials continue to be first and foremost are significant challenges only in terms of their sheer number, but that is very closely followed by the issues affecting our commercial fireground. And we've delved into that in our previous series on the commercial fireground. For many of you, if you recall back, we did a 6-part, multiple-part series talking about the commercial fireground and the distinctive issues affecting and the operational challenges that are affecting that particular structure.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, that exposure leads to cancer. Protect yourself with MagnaGrip. To learn more, visit magnagrip.com.
We talked about the significant challenges affecting the commercial fireground and our 6-part series that, again, discussed the various challenges and operational issues affecting both single site and as well as complex the commercial structures and so forth. So when we talk about these modern challenges, we talk about going beyond conventional tactical responses and so forth, or conventional tactical responses, residentials, large area residentials or LARs, the mega mansions, of which, again, we've created the subset in our previous conversations, multiple occupancy dwellings, podium construction, mixed-use occupancies, and again, commercial buildings, typically around that 30,000 square foot or less demarcation, continue to be a significant challenge point when we talk about, again, that vastness of difference from the Main Street structure to that mega mansion. Modern retail, service, business structures, hybrid construction, the adaptive reuse, reutilization of our buildings, and again, renovations, conversions, and alterations to our buildings. And unfortunately, the newest type of type 4 construction, where we start talking about mass timber and both the cross-laminate timber or hybrid structures. Again, it is not occupancy type, but occupancy risk, where we get into that particular aspect. One of the things that again, we should put into context, especially as we started our program talking about Main Street. I'll say this, we talk about yesterday's fireground, and there's some bullets here that I want to sort of bring back forward into the mindset. Yesterday's fireground, as it relates to structural fireground conditions and operations, we had both common and identifiable building construction and methods of construction, which I think is first and foremost, that has to be clearly identified. That is dramatically in conflict with the inability in today's structures, in today's newer construction, especially in the last 24 years. So there are two distinctive periods, the period of the 1980s to 2000s, and then the second period of what I call modern construction. So the period from 1980 to 2000, I classify, or I try to reinforce the aspect that it is a marked period where modern construction methods and materials became part of our construction, became part of our various types of buildings, first in the residential and then in our multiple occupancy structures, but that has moved into all realms, whether we talk about residential all the way to commercial constructions. But we had common, identifiable. However, at that time, we did start seeing the introduction of new methods and materials, and I think it's safe to say just the introduction of lightweight engineered construction or lightweight materials in that time frame from the late 1960s, early 70s, certainly became very conventional by the time we hit the 1980s and 1990s. However, that's a marked change. So we have type 1 modern construction, or type 1 lightweight construction from that era of the 1980s to 2000s. And what I've categorized is a type 2 construction of modern construction that has moved entirely into an engineered structural system standpoint, far beyond lightweight construction terminology, into the current era of time, from the around that 2000s to the current time frame. So we are seeing, again, a whole variety of unidentified building construction and certainly a much greater degree of variations when we talk about methods and materials of construction. So yesterday's fireground, more common identifiable building construction and methods of construction. Buildings behaved. The rules of fire engagement were pretty simple operations, simple tactics, direct engagement. Our world was very, very simple. Prescriptive-based construction and prescriptive-based tactics were the norm of our operation. Fire dynamics typically ended up matching fire suppression. Fire dynamics matched our fire suppression, process models, methods, and materials. So what we were doing throughout the previous 50, 60, or 70 years in that period leading up to the latter part of, or the mid part of the 1990s, saw some consistencies. And again, in the early 1980s, as we started moving into the 1990s, we started losing that commonality. We started losing the simplicity of our operations. We saw that buildings were not predictable, that building performance was degrading. In other words, our tactical windows were becoming much smaller. So one of the clear analogies between talking about the challenges and the need for a much more adaptive fireground, when we discuss the issues of Main Street operations or Main Street buildings, those typically connotate back to a tactical window of operation of around 20 minutes. And we continue to have stressors, and we continue to have a significant misunderstanding or a complete lack of comprehension that today's fireground, as it relates to our operations in all buildings, is diminished back to a best practice tactical window of around 10 minutes. And again, we've discussed this in greater detail in our previous episodes. I would encourage you to go back into the fireengineering.com archives and take a look at some of our discussions. We did have a couple of episodes where we specifically talked about tactical windows on the fireground. We talked a bit more about size up and so forth, but especially on tactical windows. And again, I'm just going to refer back and see as it comes to mind here. Although we did not script this portion of it, I'm trying to see quickly here, going back to a couple of data points on some previous programs, but I can't bring that up right at the moment. One of the things I would encourage you to look at is going back to our Facebook page or our discussion points here in our archives on buildings on the fireengineering.com archive for the podcast programs. But again, for those of you that are following our Twitter page feeds, that are following us on Facebook on Buildings on Fire, we did talk about, and as recent as a couple of months ago, we did talk about some issues on tactical windows, and I think we got into some greater detail, especially with the online postings in that particular posting of some additional information pertaining to this whole 20-minute window, the 15-minute window, the 10-minute window, or no window at all. And that, unfortunately, continues to be a major discussion and conversation that we're having nationally in our programs as we travel around the United States, that we are continuing to identify this lack of comprehension of what the tactical windows are and how they truly differentiate between the Main Street buildings to the mega mansions. And the analogy there is just old construction to new modern construction. The one commonality that all buildings share, regardless of their era and vintage of construction, is the manner in which the fire load packages that are currently present in our particular buildings, the manner in which fire dynamics are affecting the compartment and ultimately the building, that is the common denominator, that we are significantly seeing this increase in fire loading, the aspects that go back into fire dynamics in terms of fire suppression, sustainable fire suppression, fire flows, gallon per minute, liter per minute flow rates, the sustainability, the need for fast water in terms of timeliness of application. But it fundamentally goes back to those three common areas that are part of our modeling, of our adaptive fireground management modeling, of our first arriving construction tactics and safety. And it goes back to the fire behavior and understanding the compartment. The three fundamental issues, again, understanding the building, understanding the compartment, and then the human performance portion of it, affecting the companies and the teams and companies and the assemblance of that box alarm that's present. So all of these certainly suggest and lead to a greater degree of having sensitivity and adaptiveness toward the aspects of fire suppression. Yesterday's fireground, again, time was not an issue, which again was what we were getting into with our tactical windows, and more importantly, buildings allowed us to do our job. Personnel knew and did their jobs, proficiency, discipline, and rigor, mission above all, clear expectations, simple technology, manual physical brute force and determination. It's what got the job done. We had time, we had people, we could mess up and still be alive. We could not know our jobs and still be part of it, be part of the team. We could get away with it. It was acceptable, right? We were slow to change. Change was discussed, debated, vetted, was accepted, then implemented. We embraced tradition while we were making it. But again, when we talk about today's fireground, it's all about understanding the building's anatomy, operation, tactics, engagements, civilian life safety, operational and occupancy usage and levels of risk, the predictability of the building's performance. All buildings are truly predictable in terms of how they will perform on today's fireground, in terms of structural fireground conditions, if we understand the 5 fundamental elements of that building, the 5 fundamental structural aspects of that building. If we understand the building, the compartment, and then again, understand how we, based upon our resources, the limitations, the capabilities, the optimization in terms of the good and the bad of it, the struggles and the successes, or the optimum capabilities, that because we truly have a highly efficient company and forces that can engage, that we can do the job. And it goes back to those particular aspects. Part of the challenges when we talk about the issues of this vast gap, or the vast issues affecting, again, going from Main Street structures to the mega mansions, that analogy, again, we should not treat these buildings or treat any of our buildings on today's fireground in a conventional manner. In other words, for many of us, you only know what you know, and that goes back to what we are learning, what all of us are learning within our training academies, within our probationary schools, within the training and fireground environment, our in-services, what we are learning on the job, on the streets, in your communities, in the buildings that you're fighting fires within. We are learning each and every day. But again, it's the hands-on training that we are getting in terms of the physical environments that we are operating within. It's also comprehending and embracing the insights that's coming from research and R&D and putting those together. One cannot exist with the other. And again, I'm not looking to get into a significant debate or dialogue about one being possibly more important than the other. I am certainly an advocate that there is a balanced approach between experience and the knowledge that is gained through the formality of classroom training, the formality of book learning. There is a wealth of information and technical information that is not obtained, that is not anecdotal, that truly is empirical, that is coming from the information obtained through a variety of textbooks, online learnings, and so forth, that is formal and informal. I certainly don't want to indicate that there's an informality that comes about in this learning process, but there truly is insights that has to be obtained through formal and informal processes that's gained through the education and the learning process that's derived from information that is written in the context of online content, and that type of material that is accessible and available through ebooks or through the physical perusal and reading of textbooks. And I stress that because there are certainly still many books that, again, have been written in the past, and we've talked about this in other episodes that I've made reference to, that are critical books that you can still obtain. And in some instances, some of those books are available in PDF scanned formats, but there is nothing like having a hard copy, old edition of a previous textbook on either building construction, building technology, firefighting tactics, company officer leadership and development, that can take the place of that learnings and insights of what we did on yesterday's fireground and how that relates back to and being applied to today's fireground. Do not think that you are operating in a vacuum, and that is so critical. One of the things that I want to quickly, and I'm going to go to a quick couple of items here that I had staged out to talk about this. When I talked about tactically driven operations a few moments ago in our conversation, one of the challenges continues to be our misunderstanding and misapplication of our building and occupancy classifications that are derived out of the NFPA 220 standard. And that 220 standard that revolves around the classifications of our building types 1 through 5. Again, type 1 meaning being fire resistive, type 2 non-combustible, type 3 ordinary, type 4 heavy timber, and type 5 our wood construction. That is still relatively new. And by relatively new, I want to state this, is that we have only had that standard, and again, it's relative, but we've only had that standard since 1952. So in 1954, the standard was first issued. So the NFPA 220 standard on the standardization of building types was promulgated and issued. So it was developed in 1952. The first draft was issued out, and then it was published in that particular time frame. So we've gone about 69, almost 70 years since that time frame. Actually 70 years when we talk about the current standpoint from 54 to 2024. 16 previous editions have gone by. But it's important to note that, we talk about the typing of our structures, and we commonly use that in our size up and our risk evaluation and so forth. It's constantly being referred to in many of our training classes and curriculums, and many textbooks still certainly. But I have yet to see, and unfortunately, we have not had the ability to publish it beyond what we've typically published in our blog and website postings over the last 15 to 18 years, and we're still trying to move forward to get some of this insights published out in a consolidated manner of a textbook. But prior to that time frame, buildings were classified in a different standpoint. We did not have the same type 1 or type 2, and even type 3 classifications were not consistent prior to that, to the 1950s, and especially going back into the late 1800s, early 1900s, the development of the first national building code, the NFPA codes that were being developed, the NFPA ordinances, and some of the insights that were being derived from the early development of our special interest groups, the International Association of Firefighters, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the NFPA, other organizations that were coming about. Even the development of codes did not really move forward until the 1920s and 30s, with some of the specialized codes across the model codes across the regional areas of the United States. But it's certainly something to safely talk about when we talk about the first codes that were developed through the National Board of Underwriters, the first national building code that was developed in 1900 and formalized and issued out in 1915. They, again, when we talk about the evolution of codes, really from the first codes that came about as they related back to a certain evolving building type, meaning the tenement structure back in the latter part of the 1860s, 1867 to be specific. But from 1867 all the way here to 2024, there have been quite a bit of evolutions, the development of different codes and standards, different code making organizations. We go back historically all the way to the individual model building codes that existed throughout the United States, and on a regional standpoint, all the way up through and inclusive of the International Code Council, the consistency that we now have with the International Building Code, the International Fire Code, the International Code Council, the consistencies across the board, as well as consistencies with some of our of our NFPA fire codes, which include the NFPA 1 fire code, the Life Safety Code 1001, the NFPA 220 standard on typing of building construction, the 241 standard on safeguarding construction, alterations, and demolition, including some of the other things as I'm just trying to reiterate, the NFPA 1620 standard on pre-incident planning, the NFPA 5000 standard on building construction and life safety, as well as the newest guide, which is the NFPA 1700 guide for structural firefighting, science-based research. So there's a lot of things out there, but even just understanding that building typing is relatively recent over this period and does not reflect the buildings that were being built prior to the 1950s, going back again in the earlier part of the 20th century, and then certainly the late 19th century with our buildings throughout the 1800s. So there's a lot of things in there that affect our operations, considerations, and so forth, and they all fall under this whole issue dealing with building life cycles, and building life cycles continue to be the trending issues that affect us from a performance standpoint. So if we understand era and vintage, we understand when buildings were relatively built, and it goes back to our whole modeling of what we considered and what we established as being the fundamentals that are all part of why we are now talking. And again, it has somewhat become institutionalized. I'm always surprised, I guess, and just interested to see how, when we initiated this concept in the early 2000s with tying in architectural and engineering, historical precedences, historical aspects of how buildings were built, again, coming from my direct architectural background, we connected and formalized, and were able to see a direct correlation of what era and vintage can mean from a building environment standpoint, and how that relates to the fireground. And we were the first to bring that forward into the fire services discussion points, and many continue to comprehend, understand, and are now utilizing that concept in their discussions and in their books, and even more importantly, into the discussion points of strategy and tactics. So it's just an important item to note. And although there are some of those that, again, have liberally taken our concept, which we brought forward, and have put some spin on it, there's also a misunderstanding of what era and vintage has true, what we envisioned and what we postulated era and vintage to be, as it relates to our clear understanding and comprehension of historical aspects of building construction, architectural, engineering, and what that means into the timeline of how the buildings and occupancies are classified. So one of the things that we have continued to do is to put out in front of the American Fire Service and in the International Fire Service this concept of era and vintage as a fundamental aspect of understanding building anatomy and understanding how that leads to an adaptive fireground management model. So again, I don't want to get too far into that, but it is part of the formality and part of the consistent modeling and the basis of our first arriving construction, tactics, and safety models that lead back into our adaptive fireground management model that we've been talking about certainly over the last, going on 25 years now. We introduced the concept back in the early 2000s, and that certainly, as we started seeing, in other words, we started recognizing and correlating some things far in advance of what was being developed and what was eventually published into some of the early studies. We were seeing some things anecdotally materialize on the fireground. We saw some things that were occurring regarding the continuing evolution of construction techniques, materials, methodologies, and practices, and what we were seeing across the country and typically regionally, that our buildings were being affected both subtly and dramatically based upon the newest introduction of methods materials, construction, technology, the increasing span, the variations in fire loading that were changing, and how that was correlating back to a diminishing availability of time on the fireground, a higher propensity and need to have a clear understanding of watching the watch, or being more sensitive to the elapse of time during our earliest stages of fireground operations, and how the 20-minute rule was no longer applicable in all buildings. And although we may have 20 minutes or greater availability of time, there are other very critical benchmarking that occur at critical stages of our operations that commonly will fall under that 10-minute window or less, around that 10-minute benchmark. And especially as we move into the 10 to 15, 15 to 20-minute time frame, if we are not managing and operating in a manner that, again, is utilizing conservative bias, critical thinking, good observation skills, utilizing both our skill set that is developed and honed from experience to be able to put all of these things together, while, again, listening to communications, comprehending, anticipating, projecting, putting all those things together, and sometimes having our gut just tell us, there's some things here that may or may not be going according to plan, that might suggest a potential alternate route or progression of what our tactics are going to be. Don't treat our fires conventionally. They are going to be resource dependent in terms of personnel, knowledge, skills, and abilities. Time dependency, again, we have to have critical thinking and understand the capabilities and how that affects performance at the company and at the building level. Building performance, which falls under the aspects of resiliency, integrity, and time. And most importantly, that falls under the two critical components of compromise and collapse. So we talk about building performance. All buildings are predictable. We understand, again, the aspects of the 5 and 5, and understand how the resiliency and integrity over time, and how that relates back to the two most critical elements. What can compromise? What can collapse? Is it isolated? Is it catastrophic? Again, the analogy. Main Street fires are taxpayer buildings, or buildings of type 3, heavy timbered constructed buildings. Buildings of, again, I hate to use the term, but I'll use it, legacy construction, are buildings that had or were built out of materials, and construction that were more robust, that had a higher degree of resiliency, higher degree of integrity over the delta time when they were affected by fire impingement and or direct conditions, gave us more operational time. But when they did compromising conditions, for the most part, would be found to be more isolated, were recoverable, were more manageable, versus the types of catastrophic failures that in some instances can take out entire floors, ceiling systems, roof systems, or in some instances take out the entire building. In other words, the entire building may be compromised, which results into a collapse that is catastrophic and certainly not recoverable from that standpoint. We also should recognize that, again, no amount of technology, no amount of research, no amount of data findings, campaigns, or process, again, will replace the need for an application for skill-based, manual, human effort and fortitude of firefighting. And by that, we're talking about interior-based firefighting, but there's a balance to it all. So I just want to create that caveat. At the same time, stress the need and the importance of how interior fireground operations will never be replaced entirely. But there is a need in this application for skill-based, manual, human effort and fortitude of firefighting within the interior environment. But it goes back to having a much higher degree and appreciation of knowledge of some of these other fundamentals. And again, it fundamentally goes back to this aspect of time, delta time on the fireground. We talked a little bit about the 4 reads. We talked about reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the fire, which relates back to the department, and reading the companies. Those 4 reads are fundamental. And again, they're going to be somewhat different regarding our buildings and occupancy types. And And again, we dedicated a couple of other programs to the conversation and discussion of size up, and we actually had a separate program talking about the 4 reads, and you can go back to the archive program on that. Some of the prevailing issues when we talk about those elements of our buildings, again, the prevailing issues go back to knowledge, assumptions, being able to predict, having the recognition, prime decision making, or naturalistic decision making that is derived from and developed from experience. It's also understanding the acronym of BEAR, understanding the building, understanding the anatomy, understanding the era and vintage of the building, then also understanding that aspect of risk, which are part of the fundamentals of the predictability performance, that POP. Civilian life safety, again, understanding the low levels of risk that have to be put forward with protecting civilian life, first and foremost, that are mission critical, and then understanding those building elements in terms of severity, urgency, and growth, understanding the building, the compartment, the risk factors, and the resources, and ultimately this aspect of delta time. The influencing stressors that relate back to our buildings that fundamentally we are going to move into further conversations here in our next quarter, and I'm sort of setting that stage up here with our conversation here in this episode, revolve around what we call the predominant 6. And those predominant 6, when we talk about, again, from Main Street to the mega mansion, revolve around building structural integrity, compartment fire behavior, the sustainability of water and its application. We talk about fast water, the availability and the timeliness of our resources, the severity and the urgency and growth of those fires within the compartment, within that building type. And then again, the one critical element out of all of them, which truly is on a sliding scale, is delta time. And if we can consider the delta time element within that time frame of first arriving and the elapse of that 10-minute tactical window as a crucial benchmark, we will start seeing that there's a level of cohesiveness that can be applied in an adaptive manner, going from, again, the challenges affecting Main Street buildings of type 3 that, again, have had a life cycle, although they may have been built in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. They all have continued to undergo a variety of life cycle changes over these decades and or centuries of time now as we move from the 1900s into the 2000s here with 20 plus years of elapsed time. Those all are things that are affecting aspects of that building, the aspects of the occupancy, especially the occupancy changes that are going to be influenced by delta time. And the delta time element, as we get into our future conversations, is going to be a critical element. If we can start comprehending the importance of that time within that 10-minute to 15-minute window, and how it no longer has the applicability of the 20-minute time frame of the past. Again, we are going to be more mission focused. We are going to be able to integrate a better and more improved level of operational integration, and may actually give us that tactical edge to conduct some critical operations for the benefit of civilian life safety, to be able to do our jobs for what better standpoint, or for better words. We've got to be able to manage those levels of risk. I think it's important. I think the influencing stressors in those buildings, again, from Main Street to mega mansions, fall within what I call influence stressors and risks, especially on the first due. It's understanding the aspects and identifying the criticality of the compartment as it relates to the building structure fire. It's understanding the compartment as it relates to the building fire behavior. So again, compartment, building, structural fire, compartment, building, fire behavior. It's understanding and comprehending the predictability of resiliency and integrity in each one of these building and occupancy types and classifications. It's further developing a skill set in the predictability. And again, we have talked about this extensively throughout the last number of years in all of our previous episodes. So if this is the first time you're hearing about predictability performance, again, it is a fundamental element of our fireground modeling. It's fundamental to having an adaptive approach. But again, I'll go back to the statement that I continue to make and stress, is that all buildings are predictable if we know how to read them, if we understand the fundamentals of their construction beyond the 5 fundamental building types, beyond the cursory aspects of occupancy use, having a clear understanding of the risk aspects, and again, going back to the 5 and 5. And what are the 5 and 5? Those 5 critical elements we talk about predictability are built upon 5 fundamental aspects that are drawn out of all buildings, from Main Street to the mega mansions. It's understanding the building's anatomy that are inclusive of era and vintage of construction. It's understanding the occupancy type, occupancy risk, and occupancy characteristics, of which there are approximately 6 bulletized points that fall under each category, under the building anatomy and under the occupancy usage and considerations. The third element is the collapse and compromise characteristics. So all buildings have a predictability of compromise and or collapse, everything from negligible to nil, from nil to negligible to extensive, and again, something that can be predictable in the earliest standpoint, or something that may occur well beyond the tactical windows and the benchmarking, that the fire will be certainly out of control, under control. Companies will be picked up before any consideration may even need to be put forward to it in an upfront standpoint. So there is this predictability that we have to develop the skill set on. It's the compromise and collapse considerations. It's understanding how the importance of building intel, both pre-arrival, pre-incident, the things that you need to be looking at out there in your streets each and every day, on or off duty. And again, the final aspect of that goes back to the considerations of the delta time. If we have and develop this greater appreciation and understanding and apply it both at the company and at the command level of the appreciation of elapsed time, delta time within that 10 to 15 minute tactical window as a benchmark, not as it relates back to par, we will certainly be doing some things that equate back to operational excellence, mission focus, and understanding the 3 criticalities of building, compartment, and company on the fireground, and then managing those risks upon that first due in that operational period of intervention, the time elements, having an appreciation for the tactical windows, and certainly, without question, being able to apply recognition prime decision making, applying recognition prime experiences, those experiences that are derived from the day-to-day responses, and however extensive or however limited a fireground operational time and experience you may be. You've got to be able to implement that. And again, the continuing challenges, the challenge for today's companies and incident commanders on the modern fireground, from Main Street to the mega mansions, is a clearly recognized building performance factors and inherent construction characteristics that are fundamental to the manner in which a building, in which its anatomy and the fire conditions that are present, that present themselves or are evolving in an incident, and be able to ascertain and distinguish how it will subsequently perform during fire under duress, and how our incident priorities are going to be implemented to be able to carry forward to conduct mission critical focused operations at the task and at the tactical level. We've got to be able to put those things forward. So there's a lot of different aspects to that. And again, a lot of it comes back from street, curbside conversations, kitchen table conversations, walking tours that we constantly stress the importance of. You've got to get out, take a look at your buildings formally and informally, building performance characteristics, identifying the risks, having tactical considerations, understanding the limitations and challenges of the built environment, as well as the company standpoint relative to reading that fireground, reading the building, reading the compartment, and being able to share that building intel on arrival, things that we know, things that the company knows, things that the shifts may know, things that the department may know. So always, again, the point of conversation there is that share that information with other companies beyond, let's say, beyond the battalion, beyond the division, beyond your home department. For those of you that are relying on mutual aid responses, you've got to share the insights that you're developing at the departmental level with those other companies and departments that are coming in that may be responding and being part of that fireground. So again, when we talk about structural building fires, it's understanding that predictability of performance, relating that back to building the compartment, resiliency, integrity, and time, putting that together with severity, urgency, and growth, having that building intel, and putting things into action at the tactical level. It's safe to say, and again, this goes back to a number of different sources that it was derived from. But again, the University of Georgia back in 2010 issued a root cause analysis study, and they talk about the inadequate preparation for or anticipation of adverse events and during operations and how they affect both adverse conditions that may very well lead to line of duty deaths. And that actually is one of the 4 root causes that was derived out of that study, where the inadequate preparation for or anticipation of adverse events during operations was a contributor toward line of duty deaths. So it goes back to this fundamentals of size up, predictability, goes back to understanding the building and so forth. Let me go back to, again, the 5 fundamentals because I left off. So I talked about building anatomy, I talked about occupancy, type, and risking. Collapse and compromises of the 3rd item, and with that's common to all buildings from the main street to the mega mansions. The 4th item is the methods and materials of construction that directly relates back to era and vintage and building anatomy. And then the 5th piece is the aspects of fire dynamics within the building. Those are the 5 fundamental core elements that are part of the predictability of performance modeling and considerations. And then the mission critical aspects of building performance fall under understanding the roof characteristics. And we talk about functionality of the building, it's understanding roof construction or the roofing systems. It's the perimeter walls. So number 1 is roofing system, perimeter walls, what's enclosing the building. It's understanding the floor and or ceiling conditions. It's understanding the compartment. And the 5th most critical element we talk about the functionality of our buildings is the absence or presence of voids. So those 5 and 5 give us and contribute directly to predictability of building performance. And again, it's sort of a opportunity here for us to revisit that conversation piece, as this is going to be important in our upcoming episodes here as we move into the last quarter of September, October, November, December. Our upcoming 4 episodes are going to revolve around those aspects in a greater degree of consideration. So I'm going to, I think, leave off or leave our conversation off at this particular point. I wanted to talk a little bit about some tactical risks associated with those elements here. But it's safe to say that as we talk about these commonalities from Main Street to mega mansions, there are 3 common influencers. We talk about building integrity. So again, building integrity is the collapse and compromise over the delta time, elapsed delta time element. We talk about fire severity, fire behavior. We talk about the megawatts of energy, fire load packages over delta time. And then the other critical element there that, again, relates back to each building occupancy type and construction type relates back to human performance. And that human performance is the company performance or the box alarm performance of what the companies can do individually, at the individual, at the team, at the company, at the overall alarm effort over elapsed time. And they all go back to company integrity, accountability, expectations, performance, and yes, guys, it's fortitude and rigor that all come about to it. So those are part of the variables that are out there, some things that lead back into the conversation pieces of the adaptive fireground and start affecting the concept of predictability. So we're going to further talk about the predictability modeling. We're going to talk about some things associated with each one of these in the upcoming series. We're going to talk about the residential. We're going to talk about conventional residential, large area residential. We're going to talk about the mega mansions and mini mansions in one upcoming series. All of that will focus in on the residential component. We're going to dedicate another program specifically to a single episode of talking about sizing up predictability modeling of the commercial fireground, a little bit more focused, that again is going to pick up on some of the more elaborate conversations that we had in our 6-part series. We're going to further enhance some of the insights that came out of the OTA loop that Colonel John Boyd first talked about in the late 1950s, and how, again, we've integrated that in our size-up modeling. We talked a little bit about that in our first 2 size-up program and series in our previous episodes, both in 2023 as well as 2022. We talk about observe, orient, decide, and act, and how they are so mission critical in today's size-up characteristics. We will continue to talk about some of the challenges that are impacting operations in terms of our built environment, social, economical, and ecological issues, the green movement, aspects dealing with engineered structural systems, both as they relate to component systems, assemblies, construction, and processes. We will continue to talk about and elaborate and have conversations on the evolving challenges of large area residentials, or LARs, including mega mansions, giga mansions, tetra mansions, as well as our most recent edition of our mini mansion. So we did a program in the beginning of this past year in Nebraska talking about the mini mansions as a standalone effort. And it was interesting to note against that some of these terminologies actually slide. What you may consider to be a mega mansion in your first due or your response area may actually be of a smaller square footage in another area or another region of the United States. So we actually have expanded and included some additional enhancements in what we classify as the common conventional residential structure, our large area residentials, our mini mansions, and then our mega mansions, giga mansions, and tetra mansions. We need to stop utilizing the term that is really ineffective today when we talk about mech mansions. But again, we'll talk more about hybrid structures, light gauge metal, type 3 construction, adaptive reuse, high risk, large vacant commercial industrial properties, the CPs. We'll talk a little bit more about pop-up construction. Vacant and derelict buildings is going to be on our radar screen here. We're hoping to do a couple of different things with vacant and derelict buildings, as well as expanding upon some terminologies that will be coming forward in some upcoming publications, upcoming NIOSH reports, where we've developed some additional terminology for the definitions of occupied derelict buildings and occupied vacant structures and so forth. Some things that I think you'll find interesting. We've alluded to them in our previous episodes and other series and conversations, but we'll talk about all of these particular aspects here as time permits in our upcoming episodes here. So again, some of these issues are conflicting with best practices, methodologies, and modelings. We are continuing to see diminished or loss of fire service experience. We're continuing to see a lack of building intelligence, a lack of knowledge. We just don't know our buildings. We just don't know building construction. We think we know, but we really don't, and how that leads to, again, some challenges on today's fireground. So as we move forward, we will talk about identifying some best practices. We will continue to talk about the evolving building and construction sciences. We will continue to introduce fireground considerations toward the concept of a fireground architecture and the fireground architect. I think it's important to understand some things that are going to be evolving here that certainly may change some considerations and change some perspectives regarding the emerging and influencing trends and challenges with today's fireground and operations. So without further ado, again, I think it's safe to say we'll conclude our episode here at this particular standpoint without getting too much further along, which may lead us further into a lot more conversation pieces. So until next time, companies are in quarters or off the air. Stay safe, but keep in mind that, again, a job is being worked somewhere in the streets in your city, across the country, and around the world, doing what we do best and being who we are, and that's firefighters. So stay tuned for our next episode of Buildings on Fires. I think it's safe to say that we've got a couple of new things coming about. We're going to do a little bit of rebranding of our Buildings on Fire focal point here. We're not going to lose the essence of it, but a couple of things to maybe rebrand and refocus some of our conversation here to make it more applicable to the current and evolving fireground aspects. We're continuing to hope to have some additional opportunities here with fireengineering.com. Look forward to seeing how those play out here. So again, thanks very much for tuning in on this episode of Buildings on Fires, taking to the streets, talking a little bit about bookending some of the conversation pieces from, again, the Main Street to the mega mansion. So thanks for tuning in. We look forward. Stay safe. And until next time, again, understand your built environment, get out in your streets, take each and every opportunity to learn more about your buildings, about construction, and apply it to your next job and operation. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.